Hello and welcome to the Introduction to Glyphs app, the software that you'll be using in the Typeface Design course, or YSDN 3003, to develop your variable font typeface. This introductory video is just going to get us started with the basic workflow inside Glyphs, the different spaces that you'll work within, and the different tools that are available to you. So it's just to get acquainted with the software. Won't be doing any kind of designing or anything. That will come in the following video. So if you launch the Glyphs app, when you install it with the software uh, temporary trial that I've acquired for everybody, you should see this icon come up just like any other program, and then you launch the app. I've got it open already. And you'll notice that when Glyphs launches, you don't see anything at all on the screen, except you'll see on the toolbar in your top left corner of your screen with the Glyphs name of the program, as well as the different application folders and submenus that you can access inside there. It's really like any other program. You've got your file, edit. A glyph would stand to some, or would stand for, sorry, for some things that you'll be doing when you're actually drawing your typeface and developing it. Same thing with paths. That's particularly concerned with when we're dealing with vector curves. Filter is an area where you will be, of course, doing things like merging. So remove overlap is the terminology in Glyphs for merging. This can be confusing at first because many other design applications tend to call this merge or merge outlines. They call it remove overlap, which makes logical sense. It's just not something that we might be familiar with in other softwares. So just so you know, that's how we will merge our outlines together into one solid outline. But you notice there are other fields here too. We don't really need to worry about these ones as much. We might care about fixed compatibility. We might care about things like round corners or roughen. I'll show you how those work in a later video. But in particular, we care about these. The view window will handle our drawing tools and our drawing workspace inside Glyphs. Script window, we're going to download some scripts in a later video for you to use, and you're in particular going to want to download the Mecha Blue scripts. These are by Rainer Scheichelbauer, who's one of the developers, the main developers of the Glyphs app, and he's written a lot of great Python scripts that we can run, and there'll be some really useful ones for us when developing a variable font design space. Window is going to show you the files that you have open, but there's not too much in here that we need to know for this video either. Okay, so to make a new file, you go to File, New, or you can hit Command N on your keyboard for the shortcut. And when you open up a new Glyphs file, there you go, you have a font window to work with. With this window that we see right here, we just call it the font window. I sometimes refer to this as the font encoding window, or I like to think of it as the font map. This is kind of the map of my entire typeface, because within here, obviously I can see A to Z, capitals and lowercase. I can see the numbers 0 to 9, the lining figures. I can see some basic punctuation and the spacebar character. So obviously I can click, if I look here, I can click on any of these glyphs. So these would actually represent the glyphs in my typeface. These are the glyphs that are active right now, and they will export with my font file. So anything that I see in here will export with my font file. However, I don't have any content inside these glyphs at all right now. There is no vector outline data inside any of these glyphs, and there's also no fitting information, kerning information, open type instructions, etc. We haven't done anything yet. We've just opened the file. What you see on the left side is sort of tabs that organize the encoding or your font map based on, it could be different encodings that follow the Unicode standard, or it might be a customized set that you have designed. So you see at the very bottom filters here. For instance, for a Canadian syllabics typeface that I've worked on developing. I've developed my own kind of custom encoding, which I had to do because there were no preset ones for Glyphs app. So I had to go and develop my own so that I could organize the typeface and actually work on it. But we obviously don't have to do that for most of the typefaces I'm assuming that you'll be taking on in this class. However, if you wanted to work on a non-Latin typeface, for instance, if you were interested in working on Arabic, hypothetically, what you would do is you could come down to languages here, you click on Arabic, you click on the Arrow tab, which will bring down a sub-menu, and you'll see the different subsets of character maps for the Arabic script in particular that you can activate. And if I want to activate, let's say, a basic Arabic encoding, what I can do is I can go to Basic and I will control click. This I cannot show you graphically up here. You have to follow the key commands. So control click. And what you see here are just simply a listing of the glyphs that are available inside this encoding. They call it missing glyphs because technically we had 0 of 181 active right now. So if I want, if I want to activate everything, I go to the very bottom, I shift click, select everything, and generate. And it's going to generate all of these basic Arabic glyphs. Now notice this preview shape that you see in the background. This preview, these letter forms that you see in the background, these are not actually glyph vector outlines that are drawn inside the glyph. These are, think of it like a ghost image that just shows you the intended shape that is supposed to go inside that glyph. However, be aware, outside of Latin script, it's not guaranteed that all of these ghost images will be the correct images because it depends on whether this typeface that the Glyphs app has encoded into the app to show this preview, if it actually has all of the parts, because some character sets could be very, very large. They might not have all the letterform shapes that you actually maybe need in an extended Arabic character set for the languages in East Asia, for instance, that would be written with the Arabic script. Because they are outside of the modern standard Arabic or classical Arabic or Persian Farsi, they might not have all of the diacritical forms or special letter forms that might be needed for that. So just be aware of that if you're working on something outside of the Latin script. For the most part, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, which would be Hangul. Of course, if you wanted to activate Hangul, you do the exact same thing. You can also just activate a little bit of the character set, or you can activate the whole thing, and then you're starting to build your map. If you do not see something that you need in any of these areas here, so any of these sub-tabs, what you do is you go up to Window and Glyph Info. The Glyph Info tab under Window shows you all of the glyphs that are available inside the Glyphs application, but that are not available necessarily through here. They could be available in here. You will find the same glyphs in here that you see over in these tabs and sub-tabs. However, there are many, for instance, Chinese. Chinese, you cannot activate necessarily the entire encoding that you need through here. So what you would do is you would come into the Glyph Info and you would go find them. And you notice that this is a massive window. So what you're seeing here, this is a good opportunity to show you how to look at this window. What you see here is this, they've categorized what type of glyph it is, but also they've said what script it is. So Khmer, this script, this glyph belongs to the Khmer script. It's within that grouping of an encoding. Mongolian, you just saw fly by. Latin, these are special Latin glyphs. If I keep going, Hebrew, Gujarati, Kana, which is part of Japanese, katakana, and Hangul. So you could find the Hangul characters in here, but you probably don't need to activate them. Han is what stands for Chinese, and if you type in Han, under the script category, Han will show up as a sub search, and you can find the glyphs. But unfortunately, they won't have a name assigned to them. You might have to search for it differently. Another way to add glyphs, and this is just for people who are working on encodings that are not that are non-Latin. Let's open up a browser. Sorry. Let's quickly do this. There is a way to add glyphs that you cannot find for some reason inside Glyphs, just so that you could work on them and you could order them into a different encoding, let's say in another way. So let's say I'm working on Chinese, and I'm doing, could be Chinese traditional or simplified, it doesn't matter. And maybe I'll go to a wiki page because I want to find that. Or what I could do is I could say, I want to build a small sample encoding for Chinese, like 12 or 16 characters, let's say, because I just want to give an idea of the design that I want to develop before I develop it further. So I need to find these characters. Now, if you are familiar with typing in pinyin, you could type in pinyin, and that would be fine. You could enter the characters here. You could likely enter them directly in Glyphs as well, but let's say you don't. Let's say I need to find the Chinese character for love, which I know you'll be able to find in Glyphs, but this is just another way to do it. So I want to find the Chinese character for love. Google Translate might come up, or maybe I'll have to scroll down and actually find it in the text of some web page. What I can do is copy this, because remember we talked about Unicode. Unicode is the universal standard for encoding any script in the world. Unfortunately, some scripts that are have a very small user population might not have a Unicode standard yet, but more and more are added all the time as the years go by. However, Unicode is a universal standard, which means that the Unicode values that I find in a browser, for instance, this character that I've copied, will also be available. It will be recognized inside Glyphs. It'll be recognized inside InDesign. It will be recognized in my cell phone texting application. Emoji, for instance, also has a Unicode value. So, for instance, I could hit Command-C, copy, on my keyboard, and then I can go back to Glyphs, and if I want to add a glyph, I'll go to Glyph, Add Glyphs, and I will paste this glyph into this window. And when I hit Generate, it's going to give me, ta-da, love. And an interesting looking love. This must be, I thought this was traditional. Anyways, there you go. You've added a glyph. But let's say that, yeah, let's say I want to develop an emoji. So, emoji character for love. Any of these characters, it also has a Unicode because I can type it out. So, if I go copy that heart face, I have to admit I've never pasted an emoji in this way. It might not work. You see, I've pasted that emoji in because it's a Unicode character. I've generated it. Now, it won't let me do that. We would have to do that differently, but we're not going to do that today. Save that for another video. However, as you can see, you can paste in characters that you might not find in Glyphs. So this is a useful technique for students who are going to work on a non-Latin typeface. But let's say also I want to open up old style figures. I can activate old style figures by going right-clicking, selecting everything, generate, and I get the old style figures. Notice they're called 0.osf, stands for old style figures, and it is different from the main lining figures. These glyphs here are the default glyphs that are encoded to your keyboard, where it goes from 1 to 0. These are literally 0 on my keyboard without holding down any keys, 1 on my keyboard, etc. Old style figures would have to be accessed through an OpenType feature, which we'll write in a later video. Okay, so now when I click on all, I see everything that I've activated in my font. If I don't want something inside my typeface, like I don't want old style figures, I select the glyphs that I don't want, I go to the minus sign and I remove them, and they remove from the font. Okay, now How do I draw a letter in my typeface? To draw a letter in my typeface, I have to double click on any of these glyph cells. And what I do is I open up my glyph drawing window. Now, when you install Glyphs, you're not going to see this bar at the bottom, and it's definitely not going to be in the black, the negative reverse color. You're probably just going to see something like this when you open up the app. This area that I had open down here with this eyeball icon is a kind of, think of it as a toolbar at the foot of the app. And what this allows me to do, and I can change the contrast value, is when I start getting type drawn inside my program, I can actually preview and test my glyphs down here. I can also, once I get some OpenType features, as soon as I write my first OpenType feature in the program, a little tab box is going to appear down here and it will say features. If I click on that, a submenu will pop up and I can choose the features that I've written, but we won't get ahead of ourselves yet. What I see inside the app right now, or I should actually backpedal for a second, the reason why my app had this open is because Glyphs will remember what your workspace generally looks like, which is part of why this is open. So that's why I have this open at the moment. I'll minimize it right now. Okay, what we're looking at right now is we are looking at a blank glyph which represents the letter E. So notice, this is the human readable name, E. However, this glyph is technically identified as 0065. That's the Unicode marker for the Latin lowercase e. Italic, Roman, it doesn't matter. Script typeface, serif typeface, sans, does not matter. This is the universal code that the lowercase Latin e gets, 0065. What you also see inside this gray box is this is basically the glyph info panel. This tells me what the glyph is that I'm working on. Now I could also customize this glyph. I could call this glyph e.swash. Sorry. I can rename that glyph, but now technically there is no Unicode value because this is a custom glyph. It doesn't know what that E is, but notice now it comes back. What you see here are the side bearing values, which are the left and the right side bearing, which is the right and the left of the glyph. Remember, we talked about in class, I was drawing diagrams on the whiteboard about the concept of what a glyph is, typographically speaking. The glyph itself is what gives the typographic process its ability to function in general. It's what allows us to mechanically reproduce each character image that we draw. That could be a letter form, it could be an ideographic form like in Chinese Han characters, it could be punctuation marks in any script, diacritics, it doesn't matter, but they all sit inside a glyph. Now, technically right now, my glyph is 600 units per M wide. That means if I take my measurement tool, so here's our first tool. Right now we have our selection tool, and if I hold down the selection tool, I can select all layers or selection tool, but we'll keep the normal one. The measurement tool allows me to click and drag and measure an area. Once we get some outlines in here in the next video, we'll actually be able to measure the thicknesses of our strokes this way. But if you notice in the center of that red line, you see 828, and as I continue to drag, sorry, I slipped. That 1257 right now is the width right now of what I'm measuring. So if I was to take this and put it on the blue, and I measure that, holding shift, by the way, I can constrain, technically this glyph is 600 units wide. I can change the width of that glyph. I could make it 200 units wide. I could make it 0, and then it would just be a blank line. I could make it 1 unit wide. We can't see that difference. I could make it 10,000 units wide too if I wanted, but that's absurd. So, okay, there's my glyph. And right now, because I have nothing inside that glyph, the side bearings say 0 because the side bearing values measure only what is at the left and the right of an object that's inside this glyph to the side bearing, which is, this is the right side bearing, this is the left side bearing. Okay, now's a good time for us to get familiar with the tools inside the glyph drawing window. I have my selection tool, which allows me to grab and select objects, just like in Adobe Illustrator. I have a pen tool which allows me to draw graphic forms, and I draw it much the same way that I would draw in a program like Adobe Illustrator. If we open up the eyeball, look, we see a shape. There's a preview of our shape. You'll notice that I like to have the bar down here reversed out with a white object knocked out of a black background, because for me it allows me to have a juxtaposition between what I'm drawing in this negative on positive state versus a negative on a positive state. And of course I could look at it this way too. It also allows me to see what I'm drawing at a smaller size, which is very helpful when developing a typeface, especially for smaller sizes. Anyway, I'll leave this open for now. So that's just my pen tool. It works the same way as Illustrator. I can draw line segments with it, and obviously I have to close it. Notice how Glyphs will not close something. It won't show you a preview of something that is not closed like Illustrator will. This is a big difference between a font development app like Glyphs or RoboFont or FontLab 6, FontForge, etc. They won't let you break out lines, which is really good because this will cause a PostScript error. In a print application and a website, it will cause tons of errors. It can cause applications to crash, even a web browser as well. Okay, the knife tool, if I go back here, the knife tool allows me to cut objects into pieces. Notice how, oh, that's actually interesting. I kept that separate, but it allowed me to cut this object. I could also go, and I can hit E on my keyboard, by the way, for a quick command to get that. P is for my pen tool. You can use this drawing tool. I don't tend to use it very often. Now, the rectangle tool, it just allows me to draw a simple rectangle. If I click and hold, I draw a circle. And if I constrain, I can draw a circle like this. Nice. I can delete that all too. If I draw, let's say I draw a rectangle that obviously is not a square, I can also rotate my objects but through the transformations panel. Right now my object doesn't have a rotation associated with it, but if I go down to this transformations panel, I can reflect objects in here, and right now I can't really reflect this, so let's make it a really odd shape. But I can reflect objects horizontally or vertically. This is very helpful when you're developing typographic shapes because sometimes you need to reflect them purely. This is our scale command where I can scale by percentages. So right now this is telling me I can scale up or down by 15%. This is down. This is scale up by 15%. If I went to 50, I would go down by 50 units, 50 percentages, or units on the grid. 45 degrees, this is my rotate tool. This allows me to rotate left or right 45 degrees. I can of course rotate at 90 degrees, just similar to reflection. And this is our slant tool. We won't deal with this unless you're working on a variable font that has an italic slant. So this would actually allow me to create a slant, let's say 16 degrees. I'm slanting my object. It's skewing it in a sense. There are better tools for doing this that we will talk about later. For instance, the remix tools, scripts, but we'll talk about those later. Okay, now we haven't dealt with layers yet. We're going to deal with that in the next video. That's when we're dealing with drawing multiple masters, which we'll deal with in the next time. The next one. Font note. In here you can actually make notes about the project. So these are, the notes. For instance, this allows you to make notes for what you're working on. You might say adjust fitting of the lowercase round shapes by 5 UPM. And you can just leave a note for yourself so that the next time you come into the program, you've got a note here that tells you your tasks that you're giving for yourself. Very handy stuff. Okay, now what we haven't talked about yet, we've talked about our glyph window. Now our glyph window, it actually allows us to type out glyphs. And we can design this way. I can type out capital letters, I can get punctuation in here that I actually have active. Right now I'm hitting the semicolon key and I don't have a semicolon in the font. I can't actually put it in there. Okay? And of course I can select this, I can delete it. I could also do this where I select a couple glyphs. Let's say I have a bunch of glyphs I'm working on in here, and I only want to actually take these ones and isolate them and work on them. I can select them and hit Command T, which makes a new layer, and I can work on them on their own, and it makes a new tab. I should have said not a new layer, but a new tab. Okay, now if I close this, I go back to the font view. Now what we have not seen is we haven't seen a very important tab in getting acquainted with the application, which is the font info, which is this eye icon. If you click on that, you'll see this panel come up. This is very important to the management of our typeface, especially with a variable font typeface, where we'll be working with multiple masters. And it's also just basically important for naming our fonts so that a program like, let's say, Adobe InDesign or CSS and HTML in a web browser will recognize the font, its name. How do we identify it in our CSS? We have to name our font. I can call my font anything I want. We can call this font Sheridan font for now. It doesn't matter. Or how about we call it YSDN font? We can put any character. Well, don't quote me on that. I don't know if you could put any character in here, but I could, I believe, put an exclam, but maybe we should leave it out for now. And I can put who the designer is, so the designer could be one of my favorite historical type designers. And you can put your URL, whatever that is. And you can put the version number, the copyright info. If you go to this refresh, it'll refresh the copyright info for you. Custom parameters in the Glyphs app are parameters that you add for dealing with the workflow that is outside of the scope of the toolbars that you see here. Or think about it like back-end stuff that you're working on. That will be things like our bold master in a variable font, our condensed master, our optical size for text or display masters. Custom parameter, if I click the plus sign or the negative, I take it away. Add it. If I click on this arrow, you'll notice that all of these custom parameters are available in Glyphs 2.6, the latest version of Glyphs. We're going to be concerned with stuff like axes and variable font origin name and force compatibility check. Virtual master, we do care about that as well. We'll talk about why that's going to be something that we can deal with in a later video. We don't need to worry about that today. The masters area is where we start working on our masters. Now when we're working in what's called a multiple master workflow, which is critical in a variable font workflow, we need to have more than one. So we'll need to at least have two. What I tend to like to do is activate, duplicate a master, like the regular master here, after I've figured out what the grid is going to be for my typeface. So these metrics, this area here for metrics, is where I define where my ascender sits, where the cap height sits, X height, descender. If I was working on an italic font, I could give it an italic angle as well. But I manipulate these values in here. But remember, these values have to equal 1000. In particular, descender and ascender value, ignore this negative sign, but this 800 and 200 value, negative 200, they have to equal a value of 1000. Obviously this does right now. And these values in between will be points, unit points, within the grid that also will, of course, exist between right now 800 and 200, but they equal 1000. Because you have to think of negative 200 like the baseline is 0, and negative 200 is 200 units below the baseline. However, think of it as 200 and 800 equals 1000. And I forgot to show you something in font. So in font, 1000 units, this is what we generally want most of our typefaces to have. Some typefaces have a unit value, a UPM value of 2048, and that's because some scripts other than Latin and some Latin typefaces as well need to be rendered at a higher, what would you say, like a higher grid step or threshold, because it allows their outlines to be rendered in a screen environment at a higher fidelity, and it also allows you sometimes more control over the outlines themselves, the handlebars. You can sometimes get a little bit more detail in the curves, but for the most part, 1000 UPMs is sufficient for most typefaces, especially for print typefaces, but for screen, for the most part, 1000 is not a problem, unless there's a very specific reason that you need to have a different value there. Okay, and then in that case, your values here would have to add up to, let's say, 2048. Okay. We'll deal with how we're going to work with setting these up in the next video. And the custom parameters that you would see here, the stems are related to auto-hinting, or the hinting process, and so are the alignment zones. We won't worry about those. Axes coordinates are going to be something that we deal with next video when we talk about entering the axis values for our variable font, because they'll matter. If I want to add a new master, I just say add a master, and I can call it something else. I can call it ultra bold, let's say, and obviously I would give it a new value, and then I can just keep adding masters and naming them. Instances are where we're going to take our masters, and we can actually output even more instances of a typeface, let's say a variable font, that will show up in the font menu of any app on your computer. So InDesign, Text Edit, Font Book will see this as well. If I wanted to, I could add an instance for each master, and it will give me, oh, that was funny. That's an error, and I'll show you why. Learning opportunity. Regular has the same value as regular, so it's a duplicate, and that can't happen. So it was saying, wait, I can't do that. So let's call this medium or something like that. Now, if I wanted to, I could say add an instance for each master. It will give me these masters as instances, but I could add instances in between these ones as well. But we're not going to deal with that now. This is just a preview. Features, this is where I will write my OpenType feature instructions. So once again, we might not have touched on this in the first class or the second class, but OpenType features are features. It's not a programming language, but they are they're instructions that we give to our typeface so that we can instruct the behavior of the typeface. And this can be accessible in the CSS or in InDesign, also in other apps, like even Microsoft Word can read some OpenType features. Other settings, you don't really need to be too concerned with this. You can do stuff like change your grid subdivisions. That's fine. You can also add notes to your font, but these are not the same as this font note. Okay, so let me close this video for now. This is more than enough stuff just as an intro. Use this video as a way to remind yourself of what the general workflow or workspace items are inside the program. When we do the next video, that's where I'm going to show you how to start doing some basic drawing in the application. We'll get acquainted with how do we draw letter forms or vector letter forms. How do we set up a basic grid for ourselves? That'll be the next video. Okay, thank you, and I'll see you in the next